Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Weygandt, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Buffett Institute. I study international oil politics and the spread of ideas. And today, I want to talk about two narratives that lie at the intersection of these topics. So the first of these narratives is big oil. Everyone in this room has probably encountered the term before, and it basically is a story in which big, powerful companies with huge amounts of resources use their money and their connections to effectively tell governments what kind of policy environment they want to operate in. The second narrative I'm interested in exploring today is not about oil specifically, but comes up a lot in discussions of development and innovation. And this is a story that divides the world into core and periphery, north and south, or developed and developing countries. And the way this story goes is that the core comes up with great innovations that spread to the periphery. So in both of these two narratives, the takeaway is that developing countries effectively operate as policy takers, responding to things like carrots and sticks or ideas that come out of the core. This particular narrative structure is somewhat problematic if we look at some really fundamental issues in oil and gas. So I explore questions that are about who owns the oil and how do we tax it? And this does not reflect the reality of those two stories. So how have we historically approached these two questions? The world has effectively developed three different models of ownership and taxation of oil and gas, running from a state-owned to a private sector-led different approach. On the private sector side, historically we've relied on something called a concession. In this system, which is more or less what we have in the US and in Europe, a company comes in, signs a contract, it produces oil, and it gets to keep the oil it produces and pays taxes and royalties on that oil. In a state-owned system, on the other hand, the government usually has a monopoly on oil and gas, and private sector companies can enter as contractors. They're paid to drill a well, and they walk away because they never take ownership of the oil. Now, in the 1960s, a third model was introduced. This is effectively a hybrid called a production sharing agreement. As the name implies, this is a model that's built on sharing of management decisions and of oil. What's interesting about this model is that it was the development of a developing country, Indonesia. So I study the patterns of how these different systems have been adopted around the world and try to understand why governments choose among these different systems. And I do this in a couple of different ways. So I've built a data set of oil and gas laws across all countries from 1960 onwards. I've also gone through US government archives to get a historical perspective and have interviewed 50 industry experts to get a contemporary perspective. Now, what do you imagine I may have found in light of these two theories I started out with? Well, if we buy the big oil and the passive periphery stories, we would expect to see a world like this, which is the 1960s world, a world dominated by the concession system. So this is a world in which colonialism is still present, and outside of the Soviet Union, the concession system, which is favored by the companies, is the dominant form. Only 7 companies basically manage the oil market in this world. Now, the one exception we can see here is Indonesia in yellow, which is the production sharing agreement. This was introduced in 1960, and it took 6 years for the first contract to be signed because it was so hated by the companies at the time. Fast forward 20 years, and the world's already looking quite different. This is a world of post-colonialism in which governments have a lot more control over what kind of system they have, and we're seeing some experimentation with the production sharing agreement in other countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, this is still not hugely spread, but 20 years ahead, we're seeing a tipping point. At this point, the production sharing agreement is not just an acceptable or experimental approach towards governance, it is becoming the norm in much of the world. Half of all countries use the production sharing agreement either alone or in conjunction with another system. So this is a real sea change. And not only that, but with Mexican oil reforms, we're actually seeing the production sharing agreement penetrate into the developed world. This is not the world we would expect to see under those two narratives that really dominate our discussions. This is a world, those two narratives would propose that the production sharing agreement would either never have emerged because it is a developing country idea, or it would have been suppressed by powerful oil interests. Clearly, that's not what happened. So what did happen? Well, the world of big oil is basically a world in which coercion reigns. Coercion meaning carrots and sticks, trying to convince different governments to do different things. But actually, governments respond to a lot of other things. And one of the things they respond to, which I study, is learning and imitation of other countries. In fact, it makes a lot of sense that a developing country would look to other developing countries when it's learning. They have similar experiences. So the production sharing agreement actually has certain advantages. Beyond this, we can also find that in terms of the broader takeaways of this research, there are a couple main lessons. First off, we are grossly underestimating the power of governments. Not only do developing countries have the power to resist coercion, they learn from each other as well, but they're also potentially innovators. And as a developed country, we should be looking more at the ideas that they come up with because they might be useful to us. Another important takeaway is that this is a way to approach how to contribute to better governance. If we identify best practices in a particular policy area, rather than naming and shaming or relying on carrots and sticks, we might actually be better served by trying to package lessons from other countries and persuade governments that this is actually in their interest. So I hope today I've demonstrated that some of the major narratives we hear when we talk about developing countries are flawed, and that by challenging these narratives, we can actually find interesting ways to improve the world. Thank you.